music. And the basic premise is that five former friends from high school, 1 year out of graduation, descend on a remote estate for a reunion of sorts. They've all fallen out of touch in this year following high school. And after they graduated, their friendships pretty much dissipated. So during this seminal weekend, they come together and have a near-death experience in a car. They believe that they survive and come back to this estate only to find out when a mysterious man knocks on the door that they've entered something called a Neverworld wake, which, to put a long story short, is a limbo of sorts. And in order to free themselves from this purgatory, they must do one of two things. One, solve the mystery of the sixth member of their group named Jim. And two, they must vote on who is going to survive and return back to normal life and who is going to die. There can only be one survivor.
Sounds about right. So this book is a bit of a departure for you, as it is your first YA young adult novel. Can you talk a little bit about that and what led you to write a YA novel?
Yes, of course. I always knew that I wanted to contribute in some way to YA because as a teenager, books were my life. They were my social circle. I read voraciously as a teenager and fell in love with books like The Outsiders, A Wrinkle in Time, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, all of C.S. Lewis. So I knew as an author, I wanted to contribute to that space. I didn't know the how and the why until I was in the throes of writing my third adult novel. And I had this little idea about these five friends coming together. I wanted to see if I could write a short novel without sacrificing anything in terms of creativity and plot and all the things that I get very excited about in the course of writing a novel. I wanted to see if I could keep myself to a much stricter canvas and for the story to have a certain velocity to it. Also, I was very much influenced by Agatha Christie, who, when I was a teenager, she was one of my favorite authors. I was raised by my mother and my grandmother, and my grandmother was just a huge Agatha Christie fan. So very early on, she was handing me these murder mysteries. So I started writing murder mysteries when I was like 6 or 7 years old. At the time, I had very little real concept of what murder was. So that she really instilled in me this lifelong love, these mysteries. But of course, there's that very famous Agatha Christie conceit where, a group of people from disparate backgrounds come to a remote place that they can't escape. So I loved that claustrophobic feeling of being stuck. And in this day and age where it's so easy to float away from uncomfortable situations, I wanted to see what could happen when my characters were stuck and they were forced to really unravel some of these secrets that they're all hiding.
So were the characters a product of the plot, or did you come up with the characters first? How did you go about writing the story?
Well, I definitely came up with the concept of being trapped in time and using that as a way to solve a mystery. Obviously, I was influenced by Groundhog Day because I love the idea of having no consequences, at least no consequences in the physical world sense. Of course, there are psychological consequences for the characters. So allowing yourself to have a level of expertise and allowing this conceit of being trapped in time to make you really the most incredible detective in the world, because you can figure out, you can really meet anyone and figure out how to woo them. You can become like an expert con artist in interviewing witnesses or finding out information. So taking the concept, of course, beyond Groundhog Day, using that as a way to become like the ultimate Sherlock Holmes. So I definitely had that in my head. And then in a godlike way, I began to figure out, okay, who do I want to drop into this little biosphere and torture them for a while before everything works out.
And it almost is science fiction, fantasy, supernatural-like. What was that like for you? I know that's also a departure.
Yes, it was fun. It's so funny. Maybe it was because I was writing YA for the first time. I didn't think of it as, wow, I've previously written a lot of realistic novels. Now I'm going to write sci-fi. But then Night Film had a lot of sort of mysticism and things that could be explained either realistically or in a more imaginative way. So I think it actually didn't feel like that big of a departure.
Yeah, I was reading while I was reading the book. It didn't feel like science fiction. But
Right.
then when I was telling a colleague of mine actually about the plot, he was like, "That's totally a science fiction book."
Right. I think for me as an author, you always have to establish the rules of the novel at the outset, and as long as you adhere to those rules, you could be on Mars, you could be on planet Xenon, you could be traveling back in time, and as long as you adhere to those rules, that can be your reality.
So there is liberation within these science fiction rules.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. So now that this is your first YA novel, how do you feel about the reception, particularly Beltris choosing it as the first YA book of the month?
Oh, I absolutely, because I had actually followed that group and knowing that they were a fan. I mean, I just feel so grateful to, set out in a new genre and really feel like a debut author a little bit, because very few people in YA know Special Topics or Night Film. So I was telling you before, I feel very, very anonymous, and it's really fun, a fun world to enter into, primarily because there's so much enthusiasm from readers. I mean, the way teenagers I found read a book is very intense and very emotional, and the connection with it is just really kind of kinetic, and so that's really exciting to see that reaction for my book and other books as well, and I really approached this entire process as if I knew nothing, and I had some wonderful people, my editor at Random House, Delacorte, Beverly Horowitz, who is really kind of a legend in the YA space. I really allowed her to sort of be my teacher through this entire process. And the first thing she said to me was that teenagers can handle all subject matter. And I never needed to limit myself. And it was funny because when I was writing this book, I was like, okay, I'm going to write it, but I have a feeling when I hand it into Beverly, she's going to young adultify it. And she's going to say, this is too extreme and this is too scary, and you're going to have to temper down what these characters are doing over here. And it was the farthest thing from the truth. She believes, and I completely support too, that teenagers can handle a full range of subject matter. And she also was a fan of my previous books and didn't want me to change my voice or my writing style in any way. The only thing that she told me that really gave me a sense of gravitas was to visualize my reader as someone who's in high school and maybe he or she is, going through a tough time, or they're isolated and they happen to pick up your book. So made me really visualize that reader, which made me really want to stand behind every single word that I wrote, and nothing was haphazard.
I mean, those topics still apply to an adult audience too. Adult could pick up your book and still feel equally as mesmerized by the story.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Yes. I mean, that's my hope. I mean, yes. I mean, fans of Night Film and Special Topics, I certainly want them to, simply because this is YA, I don't want them to think that I've, changed anything.
Well, I have one last question, and then I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Obviously, we're always interested in what authors are reading at the moment.
Yes.
What's a book you've recently read and loved?
Oh, that's so easy. I read There by Tommy Orange, and I had an advanced copy, and I finally finished it.
It came out this past Tuesday.
Yes,
so.
we had the same book birthday, and it's just a beautiful novel. And I had the chance of meeting him, and he was, just starting out on that amazing wave of when your debut is really being well received. And I very much reminded me of how I felt with Special Topics coming out, this like kind of surreal feeling. And so I'm just very excited for him for all his success. I'm also reading All the Light We Cannot See, which was another one that I hadn't picked up when it won the Pulitzer a couple years ago. Incredible book. And then I also picked up Stephen King's The Outsider, because for me, he's just like your grandfather. Like, you just need to sit down and hear what he has to say, no matter what. So yeah.
So just kind of a follow-up question to that. Do you draw inspiration from these authors that you're reading at the moment?
Oh, of course. I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I can't read a book without thinking the amount of time and care that has gone into it. And it's such a quiet process. And knowing how hard it can be at times. You just have, I mean, when people pull off these magnificent books, you just feel complete awe and excitement, I guess.
All right, well, any questions from you guys?
Yes. Hi.
I heard you just say that you were starting or somewhat in the middle of a third adult book, your quote, not mine. Can you comment on how far along you are, what we might expect?
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you anything about what it's about. I am hoping, and my editor at Random House is very much hoping too, that I will be finished by the end of the year. So as soon as I finish up here, I got to go back to the hotel and keep writing. Yes, I can't tell you any more information about that, but I'm very excited about it.
And I read in a Town and Country interview that you said that you actually started writing Neverworld Wake while you were working on this.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. That's actually how this little book came about, is that I was working and then this little idea took hold of my brain and I was writing it at the same time. And this book, because it was shorter, I finished first. Yes, but no, I'm not quitting my day job. I'm not, definitely not. Yes.
What's your favorite Agatha Christie novel? And more or less, what's your favorite sort of contemporary in that same vein?
Okay, let's see. My favorite Agatha Christie, I think it would be Death on the Nile. Simply because I think that was the one that I didn't see coming. And I also love how she doesn't shy away from these, like, dark pasts of her characters. And I remember reading it as a really young teenager and really being struck by how much she kept hidden. And then it all sort of hangs together so beautifully at the end. So I love Death on the Nile. It was also my grandmother's favorite, and she would read that book over and over again. And I love that. Like, even with my grandmother, she passed away at 101, and even, of course, she knew who was the murderer at the end, but she would still just want to sit down with these characters. She'd always want to sit down with Hercule Poirot, which I totally relate to, and still just hear those voices. And so that really made a big impression on me. In terms of, you know what, I haven't read a really, really good mystery lately where I haven't guessed the ending. So I'm trying to think. I think it's hard to pull one over on me lately. Does anyone have any suggestions?
Actually,
I'd love to. Oh, Magpie Murders. Okay. Okay. Actually, I have one.
The Perfect Nanny by Leila
Oh.
Slimani was really good.
As an Agatha Christie, he kind of mimics
Oh,
it.
yes.
That's a book within a
And well, is it Anthony Horowitz? No,
yes,
Anthony Horowitz. Okay.
Midsummer Murders.
Yes. Okay, that's right. Which I'm a fan of that. Anything British with mysteries, good. Yes.
So we're talking, this is something that's very interesting. Do you think it's for me, most people would assume that writing for younger audience is easier. I think it's more difficult, precisely because you have to kind of retain certain complexity of text and tone and phrasing. Did you think that was more difficult, or so it came naturally to you?
I find all of my novels difficult in a good way. I mean, I think this was not an easy novel to write. There was a speed to it. I think I wrote this, I think Special Topics and Night Film took me about 3 years, because each draft takes about a year. But this, I think I wrote it in about 9 months in terms of the first draft, and then I did about 3 drafts with Beverly. But there was a speed to it, but no, it was absolutely difficult. I always feel that if I'm not really challenging myself and afraid as an artist, I'm not pushing myself enough. Like every book that I set out to write, I want to be afraid that it's going to be a monumental failure, because that artistic edge that you feel really pushes yourself. I'm speaking for myself. It really pushes me. If I wrote just Special Topics 2.0 and Night Film 2.0, that's not what excites me creatively as an artist. So all of them. I mean, this in particular, I wasn't sure if I could keep myself to a strict canvas, because I always tend to write these, grandiose books. So I wanted to keep myself to a strict canvas. And I also wanted the reading experience to be short. I mean, ideally, I want people to sit down and be unable to move until it's finished. And normally that gets sort of a bum rap, as if like, oh, that's a pot boiler book or something. But if you can keep someone, from checking their phone and standing up in this day and age, I wanted to see if I could do that. And so that, without sacrificing anything in terms of plot or creativity or story or character. So I wasn't sure I could pull that off either. And yeah.
I think you certainly did.
Oh, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Do you have any particular process when it comes to developing characters?
Sure.
Do you have any particular process for when you create your characters?
I do. I have, so all of the processes do vary. For Special Topics, I was very set on my outline, and I did not deviate from my outline because it was my first novel and I wanted it to succeed. Night Film was much more of an exploration. This was somewhere in between. But for all of them, I always start out with pen and paper, and I develop these Bibles, notebooks that I put together of character. I do a lot of writing from the character's point of view, even if I end up throwing that out. I like that process of pen and paper. So characters come about in that way, and I use a lot of visuals too. Like, I like to know in my mind what they look like. And it's not as if I, Google celebrities and like put their pictures in a notebook, is definitely not. It's more just like textures and fabrics and locations, and like almost like in that movie Being John Malkovich, when you're inside Malkovich's head, like strange little objects that might be very much like what Bee would gravitate toward if she was wandering through an antique shop. So like just all kind of paraphernalia that give me like the feel of the character, because then I can always return to that, and then in the editorial process I can also go back and see if I missed anything, or can I push this character further, or did I capture that enough? And in this particular book, and as I'm writing more books, I'm more interested in what isn't said, because there's this amazing relationship I now see between, and which I'm learning more about, between the writer and the reader. The amazing process of reading is when readers use their imagination. So I think a lot about what isn't said as much as what is. And taking things away, and then putting things back, and figuring out sort of what that perfect dynamic is. Because Special Topics was very, to me, leaving very little to the reader's imagination, really explaining everything, and my descriptions were gigantic paragraphs, and it's almost like I wanted it to come alive to the reader so much that I just like put in so much detail. And now I realize with a few telling details, like the reader will fill in things. Because it's such a, the longer I write, the more I realize that books are basically Rothko paintings. Like, you think they're so specific, but they're these giant abstract things that people project onto. And it really like takes your breath away what people see. And so I think a lot about that. Yes. Yeah, so I wrote it as a standalone. And yes, so for now it's a standalone. I might return to it at some point. There's also a book within the book, this fictitious underground book, and I might return to that as well. But for now it's a standalone, and definitely going to continue doing YA. My hope is to write adult and YA and switch between the two.
Do you know your endings before you start writing, or has the ending ever surprised you while you're writing?
I always know the ending. I don't know some of the plot points in between, but I always know the ending, which means that I won't start writing until I really think this ending is something different, something that it will surprise people. And I don't think I've ever written a book where I changed the monumental ending. Special Topics, without giving anything away, I wrote the entire book knowing the ending. Like, I didn't know anything except the final page, and then the whole book really came out of how is that possible? Like, how would something like that happen? And then I wrote Special Topics.
Did you
your characters, do you write like a psychographic of each character before you write, or?
Yes, I mean, similar to what I was saying before in these notebooks, like I do have a sense of where they're from, who they are. Yes, like I have my Bible that I return to again and again, and sometimes it can change, especially character names or like tiny details. You have to plan in advance to make sure that you're not repeating, that they're all really a different dynamic. And in this particular book, Neverworld, I really wanted them to be from very different points of views and biases and backgrounds. So I really kind of did have to cherry pick who those characters were going to be.
It's hard to solve the problem at the end, so they have to argue a lot.
Exactly. They have to argue a lot and cause each other a lot of strife.
But I
It
think
can't all be-
even in
yeah.
the book, they both, all the characters kind of figure out who they are throughout the book as well. Not just you
Yes.
as a reader
Right.
learning who they are, but them as well too. So.
Yes, I mean that was that was what I was hoping in terms of using this trope of being stuck in time because when you are stuck and you're forced to resolve certain things. I didn't know that the characters would resolve things necessarily, but yes, they had the luxury of time, infinite time, to kind of get to the bottom of all of their secrets.
You have like a different voice for each character. For example, when you write, for example, you have 5 characters. The ones you pick from this like time bubble, and each one of them, when you write about their characters, each one of them has like a kind of a different, like I don't know, like, way to express themselves and a different language and different.
Definitely. And that's something that you always have to go back and make sure that they all sound differently. And that, I mean, sometimes when you're writing quickly that first draft, 2 characters can end up sounding alike. So some of it is really meticulous work of going back and, ironing out those voices and nuances and knowing he or she wouldn't say that. And then there is the process of actually saying it out loud. Because as you're writing it and you're saying it in your head, it has a completely different feel when you actually speak these words aloud. So that's always the final thing that I do, is that I actually read it out loud. Because you always find out that you have too many words in a particular sentence. When you actually are forced to read it out loud, it's actually like this wonderful final polish. It's really good. You're welcome. Yes.
So when you're writing like media within media, like the book within the book, or the like dark web stuff in night film, does that feel different than the writing the book itself?
No, because I think I innately gravitate towards that. I mean, I think I tend to love books where there's a really meticulous, imagined world. So all of those are just extensions of what this world that I'm writing is. So no, it doesn't feel different. I mean, I love the idea of underground things and things that aren't commercial or publicized, and certainly authors that aren't on Twitter and all, and film directors who aren't doing studio pictures, but holding showings in like sewers, underground cities or something. So that's just part of my imagination and part of like the particular world that I created. But no, it doesn't feel differently. Everything is just an extension of this universe, I would say.
Should we move into signing?
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Thank you all. You of course can ask me questions if you just come up, and thank you so much for
Thank you so
being
much for
here.
having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you.